Can I just, on Ukraine, it's a little over a week, obviously, since MH17. Does the administration have any doubt that that plane was brought down by separatists using an S-11 system? Do you guys have any doubt about that now at this point?
Well, what we have seen is we've seen that there were heavy weapons moved from Russia to Ukraine, that they have moved into the hands of separatist leaders, and that those separatists who are backed by the Russians were trained by the Russians to use those systems. Those systems include anti-aircraft weapons systems, and according to social media reports, those weapons include the SA-11 system. What we also know is that the Malaysia Airlines jet was brought down by a missile that was fired from the ground. It was fired from the ground in an area that was controlled by separatists and in an area where the Ukrainians themselves were not actually operating anti-aircraft weapons at that time. So that is why we have concluded that Vladimir Putin and the Russians are culpable for this tragedy. And I guess the other thing I would point out, I'll look for my notes here, that I noticed a recent comment from Senator Chambliss, who is the vice chair of the Senate Intel Committee. He's a Republican and somebody that doesn't often agree with the White House, but he did say, whether it was, this is a quote here, whether it was the Russians themselves that pulled the trigger or Russian separatists trained by Russians, it's all the same, and it all goes back ultimately to Vladimir Putin. So that is an indication that based on somebody who has reviewed the classified intelligence assessments, that President Putin is responsible, and that is why we are coordinating with the international community on a response that targets Russia for their actions.
You can say that you're 100% certain and you have no doubt.
Well, that sort of assessment is something that would be delivered by the intelligence community, and so I'm not going to speak for them. I'd let them do that. What I was able to review for you, though, was the intelligence that has been provided that I think paints a pretty clear picture about what exactly happened and who exactly is responsible. That is an assessment that Senator Chambliss, somebody who has reviewed the classified intelligence on this matter, agrees with. Okay, John?
Yeah, if I can follow, that's a pretty extraordinary statement I heard in the most direct way I've heard it from you. You just said Vladimir Putin and the Russians are culpable. So that leads to the immediate question, which is, what do you do about it? You mentioned what the president did 9 days ago. That was before that plane was down.
It was.
So what will be done to hold the Russians and to hold President Putin accountable for the downing of that plane?
I think the fact that the president imposed this sanctions regime in coordination with our allies the day before that jetliner was downed is an indication of how aggressive the president has been leading the international community to confront the bad behavior of the Russians in this circumstance. So I'm glad that you mentioned that in your question. The question that you're asking now is a relevant one, which is, what is the international community's response going to be in light of this terrible tragedy? The president was pretty clear that he anticipated that this would be a head snapper for the international community in terms of paying attention to a troublesome situation that they had previously, I think at least in some countries, had hoped they could get away with ignoring. It's apparent that continuing to ignore the situation has had tragic consequences for at least 300 innocent civilians who are not even from either Ukraine or Russia. So what the president will continue to do is to lead the international response to confront this effort, and that means working with the international community to impose additional economic costs in the hopes of changing President Putin's calculus for dealing with this specific situation.
But that's one thing, is hoping to change his calculus for what he's going to do forward. But as we talked about earlier this week, your UN ambassador had said that the perpetrators of this must be brought to justice. What is the idea? What does that mean, being brought to justice? Does that mean some more sanctions, or is there something beyond that?
Well, I think the brought to justice language is a reference to the investigation into what exactly happened in terms of the bringing down the jetliner. That's why we've called for this transparent international investigation and for investigators to be given unfettered access to the crash site. I understand that the Ukrainians have given that authority to the Dutch to lead that investigation, and that investigation will necessarily lead to a review and an investigation into who personally is responsible for downing that jetliner.
But the
And
language you used was Vladimir Putin and the Russians are culpable.
are culpable for the situation, right? That they have been responsible for supplying the terrorists with these, or the separatists with these weapons.
But didn't you use that in conjunction with the downing of that plane? You said Vladimir Putin and the Russians are culpable.
Right, for the because of the
That's plain.
intelligence that I've laid out earlier that's already been released by the intelligence community. But you're asking a different question, which is those who are directly responsible will be brought to justice, and that is a reference to an ongoing investigation about who specifically targeted that plane and fired the weapon that brought it down.
Who pressed the button and who was there.
Exactly.